My name is Rinta-Perälä. I'm an artist, composer and a filmmaker. On this track I'm talking about my favorite Kurosawa film, Rashomon. I'm mainly focusing on the ideas and the filmmaking. That's where the interesting stuff is. This audio commentary was written by me, and it doesn't include all the basic info you can find yourself. Information is given whenever it's needed. It's important to identify what makes this film special without just saying that it's great. I always write down my own thoughts before I read anything else. These ideas and questions don't always have to be directly connected to the production of this film. The Demon Gate is being drenched by heavy rainfall. A more common name for this type of gate is Rashomon, and it means city gate. There were many gates like this, and the one in the film is looking rough. This is what it looked like about 800 years ago. And that is a rough estimate. Around this time, the gate had a bad reputation. It wasn't just unsavory people who were hanging out here sheltering. There were stories about demons dwelling in the gate itself. At least one of these evil spirits was named in legends, and the name means demon child. More about that later. This setting and its atmosphere is less about historical facts. Mythical tales and symbols have to be translated or interpreted. In this case, it has to be translated for the screen. The characters in the film refer to the demons of the gate. They symbolize human wickedness. The idea is that inevitably you would reveal something unpleasant about yourself. The characters aren't exactly afraid to do that. At least at the end. Fumio Hayasaka composed the music for this, and right now it's simple but effective. Also suitably traditional. It seems that for this type of opening sequence, with titles, credits and music, 2.5 minutes is the maximum running time before people start rioting. This film was made in 1950, but you can still do this. People often talk about short attention spans. Let's make one thing very clear. Having a short attention span is a terrible thing. In case you didn't know. In case you didn't hear the rest of that sentence, go back and listen to it again. The fact that many people have the same specific bad qualities doesn't mean that everything is justified. The filmmakers decide these things. Challenge yourself, and that way you challenge the audience. It's not about pleasing the masses. Under the roof of this half-destroyed gate, we meet the priest, the woodcutter, and soon we will also meet the commoner, aka the long-haired guy. The priest was played by Minoru Chiaki, one of Kurosawa's favorite actors. He had 11 roles in some of Kurosawa's most famous films. If I'm not mistaken, this is his first bigger role. Their collaboration started in 1949 with a film called Stray Dog. The woodcutter was played by Takashi Shimura, one of the busiest Japanese actors during his 50-year career. Kurosawa liked Shimura so much that this actor actually appeared in most of his films. The commoner was played by Kichichiro Ueda, and he also collaborated with this director many times. This is true with so many of these actors. If I'm not mistaken, he usually had smaller roles. He wants to know why these two are so dumbfounded. They say it's a story about murder, but there's something unforgettable in it that can't be summarized in an offhand way. We hear some statistics about people dropping like flies. And this is how we usually avoid reality. The real world, but also emotional reality. It's important to keep this in mind now that statistics have become the sexiest thing in the world. Some people are so happy to repeat all this stuff, but it never really adds anything to their actual happiness. The dialogue in this scene reflects our curiosity, and we hear lots of incomplete fragments. The men are not fully aware of all the events and haunting images that are about to reveal themselves. This gate was the only true set they built for the film. The city in question is Kyoto. We don't see much of the outside world in these shots. The characters are in their own space telling stories. The way these people move is designed skillfully, and the movements reflect the building atmosphere under this roof. These scenes look more like a stage play, and Kurosawa had written and directed some plays in the 1940s. He also started his film career during that decade and made 10 films. The elements are raging around the gate. They play an important role in this film. The natural forces represent impartial intensifiers. The director wanted to bring out the best in each form of weather and environment. The key elements are wind, rain, sunlight, and a neck of the woods. Even though the elements were specifically chosen, they are ambiguous enough so that every time there's an effective shot, it allows you to read something additional into it. People talk so much about the atmosphere these days, for a good reason. We shouldn't forget the atmosphere down here. No other species is keeping track of that either. Whether it's the atmosphere up there or down here, we are all mixed together. There's no ultimate shelter. The woodcutter's story begins here. He's choosing his words carefully at this point, and his story is going to change after he realizes that other people know something about this case. Kurosawa made 30 films and most of them are in black and white. I'm not familiar with his 1940s filmmaking, but black and white turned out to be a good choice for him. This film is based on a short story that I unfortunately haven't read. In that story, this place is called a grove. Here they use the location and it's actually a good place for a black and white film. You would think that it looks messy. Black and white is about shapes. That's where most of the energy is. It can be anything, any form of visible structure. It has to do with design and composition, but one of the main things is light and shadow. Some colors become equal depending on the brightness. The sunlight is used incredibly well in this black and white film. I've never seen anything like it. Both real and fake sunlight. They also use mirrors to reflect light. You have to think about things that reflect light. Leaves, clothing, skin, the weapons they have, axe, knife and sword. The characters are lit in a way that highlights their features or clothing, and sometimes they are placed in the middle of the frame. Kurosawa occasionally places spotty shadows on top of key areas. The use of black is not overwhelming. Seven Samurai has more of that. There are long scenes of people living dark spaces. Specks of light are placed very creatively in both of these films. Seven Samurai has a scene where someone is picking up grains of rice off the floor, and they look like stars in the night sky. A little side note here about another short story written by Arthur C. Clarke. It's about Buddhist monks, and it talks about disappearing stars. It means that the world is coming to an end. The samurai's dead body is discovered here. His arms look like parts of a tree. They are being kept in the shadow, much like his cause of death. I'm glad this samurai character isn't the most typical example of a heroic warrior. One thing to think about is the black and white comparison of good and evil. The cliché of dark and light. The way people dress in this film doesn't thankfully reinforce the idea that good people are wearing white. If anything, your expectations about heroic superiority are being questioned. The sun is overall a positive symbol, but its relationship with the characters is more complex. Once again, like with atmosphere, everything is mixed together. Black and white often has a striking effect. I'm a black and white artist myself. I'm doing as many things with it as I possibly can. The point of view of the priest is shown more, but it's still part of the sequence that started with the woodcutter story. He's sitting behind the priest, who is in the middle of the frame. Every person telling their version of the events to the police force is always positioned like this. They're sitting between light and shadow. The priest is the most low-key character, and the intensity is in his dialogue. The bandit is the craziest character, and predictably he's everyone's favorite suspect. He's not hiding his desire to kill, at least in this version. The bandit spends a considerable amount of time looking at the sun in the clouds. At this point is one of the more mysterious shots in the film. He's being reminded of a moment that is going to occur about 15 minutes from now. It certainly had an impression on me, and the visual narrative is excellent. Right now, this gaze might suggest that he's expecting some sort of judgment from above. The expression on his face is slightly confused. He doesn't know what's going to happen now that he's been captured. Rashomon is a great example of different narratives, contradictory memories, and stories within stories. The title of the film became a term that refers to alternative ways of describing an incident. You have your own ideal version of it, and it's connected to your personality. If you're using that term, you should also watch this film. People are sometimes more interested in reciting terminology and stock phrases, but it's more important to appreciate the origin and remind yourself of all the fertile depth in this classic. The bandit is introduced as an unreliable narrator, and it makes the storytelling even more complex. He likes to brag about his violent behavior, but he also likes to portray himself as a hero. One of the main ideas is that you're presenting your ideal self. It's good to have a character who basically doesn't know how to do that. It's true that we don't all have the same ideals, and other people can see something in our character that we ourselves are trying to cover up. This film is experimenting with retellings and the way flashbacks are usually shown. The stories are visualized, but you can't always trust these representations of people and events. The film is asking how much do we know about ourselves? How much do we know about other people when we remember them? There's so much heightened emotion in these stories and retellings. In many scenes it's difficult to tell whether the person's motives are good or bad. We get a sense of the overall nature of a character, and the strongest emotions are always revealing something important. They are not in full control of their own stories. Going back to the title of the film and the way it's being used, we live in a world of quotations. I have to admit it can be annoying, the way these films are reduced to words and phrases. Of course, it depends on who's doing it and what they're revealing about themselves. The bandit's point of view is brought into the light. Shadows of leaves are moving over his face. We are getting closer to the moment he was being reminded of when he was looking at the sun in the clouds. We still have about 10 minutes before that. It's basically the filmmakers reminding us of all those images. The wife of the samurai is going to attract the bandit's attention. She's wearing a hat with a veil and it's kind of moving over her face. There's a bunch of foreshadowing here, and also some tree shadowing. The bandit is immediately mesmerized by the wife. He's looking at someone or something he would like to have. We already know he's ready to kill in order to get it. He's basically a random guy who's going to desecrate the majesty of the samurai and his wife. But the more we learn about them, the more tangled this triangle becomes. Memories are highly cinematic. This quality is built in the DNA of filmmaking. Memories are usually emphasized specifically in stylized scenes. But more generally, you could say that what you're looking at is a framed memory in motion. This brings us to the meaning of memories. Memory is not memory without emotion. We don't just do it mechanically. These days people think they can always check their phones. Your phone can't remember anything. And artificial intelligence can't do it either. We are in some ways the sum of our memories and experiences. If you're looking for true meaning, you can't do it without using your own head and faculties. What is personal to you cannot be replicated. Only you know how to master recollection, how to connect things, places, and emotions. The world is filled with explanations, definitions, and communities. It's important to have the ability to value your private feelings. In order to be a better person, these feelings have to be internalized instead of externalized. You have to be present in the moment. They say that for a reason. Nevertheless, this is part of how we create memories. In that moment, you're feeling something precise, and it becomes meaningful. You get the whole spectrum, from the most cherished memories to the most painful ones. And that's how it should be. You have to learn how to deal with it. Memories are not just repetition or information. They say that hell is repetition, the worst kind of trauma imaginable. It's not worth remembering. There's no real depiction of punishment in this film. They wanted to avoid giving the audience that final way out. Japanese films from this period, or at least the classics, leave many things unresolved. They tell stories about people living close to nature before modern cities existed. The unresolved conflict is contrasted with being alone in nature. People disappear into nature at the end. In this part of the story, the samurai is being fooled by the bandit. There's a small portion of interaction between these two missing, so we don't know exactly how the bandit lied. The director is good at showing how the environment is alive. All the moving parts are very natural, and this is one way to avoid static sets where only people are moving. Even the most bare landscapes can have energy. Kurosawa likes using the image of dust in the wind, especially in Seven Samurai. I don't know much about samurai hierarchy, but I know that they had a lot of political power. As far as physical power goes, this Takehiro samurai character is one of the least warlike representations of the warrior caste. In this version of the events he is easily fooled, but also during all of the fights he is quite overwhelmed by the bandits' insanity. It's like he hasn't used his sword in ages. This film is amazing for many reasons, and one of the central ideas is comparing your true self to someone else's version of it. If we call the bandit a psychopath, we're still going to have the question of whose point of view are we getting. This is not the most realistic film, and that's completely fine. I would say that it's cleverly theatrical, considering the fact that we're dealing with players, characters, imagined roles, and personalities. A psychopath would be pretending to be sane, and he would use other people more covertly. The bandits we're seeing right now is so outwardly crazy that he doesn't fit any specific classification of madness. This is not the most believable retelling of what happened in these woods. When people romanticize themselves, the version they're giving you still has some inconsistencies. The bandit uses lies constantly. He seems like a person who would be proud of that. This portrait really demonstrates that he's supposed to be the worst example of a liar. Kurosawa intended the sun to be the main source of light, and in some of the shots where the bandit is staring at the wife, his face is lit with an additional source. You can use a small mirror to reflect sunlight, and you point it at the correct spot. This was a low-budget production. So many of the old classics prove that you don't need tons of money to make great films. The basic story had compelling potential, and this is one of its many adaptations. Kurosawa was familiar with different aspects of filmmaking, but he wanted to have an inseparable connection to writing. The forest where they shot these scenes was quite close to the city of Kyoto, but located in a different prefecture. They didn't spend a lot of time making this film, and the low budget was apparently one of those things that helped them get the permission for this project. Rashomon is showing us what you can get away with when your film is low budget and experimental. The film's admiration grew over the years. Unfortunately, unique films like this don't always get a warm welcome. The initial reception was a bit cautious and confused. This film is so intuitive and far-sighted. What they had was a surprisingly modern film about human nature. Confusion doesn't always mean anything. It's sometimes a good sign, even though I don't think the director's main intention here was to confuse. People in 1950 wanted clear distinctions between characters, and this film was ahead of its time in the way it mixed point of view. Maybe the audience didn't like the way experimental writing was used as inspiration. You could say that Rashomon is low-key experimental. It's not the only way to do it, but I absolutely love that. Experimentation is something I will be discussing at a later point. This film got away with so much because it lured you in. You are already in the middle of it when these complex layers start unfolding. And again, I don't think you have to take it as being duped or deceived. Here is the moment I was talking about. The bandit in the beginning was looking at the sun in the clouds. He was being reminded of this moment. The wife is looking in the opposite direction, and the rays of the sun are flashing through the branches. The shadows dance on her face. In this version, the bandit is only kissing her, but outside of this more heroic depiction of him, she's being taken violently. The bandit assaulted her and she was looking at the sun. This is an image seared in someone's brain. He can't get rid of it. He will always be reminded of this. From now on, it becomes clearer that the samurai's wife was assaulted. This was in the original story. This is one of my favorite moments in cinema history. It's done in a very natural way. This is artistic. People talk about cinema as an art form, and in scenes like this, you're actually looking at the evidence. I love the way you can internalize this. Art is a realm where ideas have a life of their own. Before the bandit's narrative comes to an end, we are going to see some more pseudo-heroic claptrap. He's challenging the samurai to a fight till death, while blaming her for creating the situation. There are 2 sword fights in total, and the first one is closer to what we would expect. You can tell the fight is slightly satirized, but also weirdly realistic at times. Caricatures distort reality, but they always have a little bit of truth. The crazy expressions of the bandit are lit well considering how much movement is in these shots. The skin becomes sweatier, and it's effective even when the account doesn't really match reality. He brags about killing so much that he doesn't even care about facts anymore. This film was ahead of its time in the way it depicts our perception of reality. In addition to that, it reminds me of how we criticize films. Even when we agree that a film deserves some criticism, we don't necessarily have the same arguments. Critics like talking about substance when it comes to the most important characteristics of a significant film. We don't know everything about substance. I would be lying if I said I knew all that. If you think you can immediately recognize any kind of substance, it's time to challenge yourself once again. Cinema is so much more exciting than that. In this film, substance reveals itself spontaneously. This is one of the most natural feeling classics of all time. It's like a gold mine filled with golden sunshine and deep shadows. When you have enough interesting ideas, you can be more spontaneous. Don't worry about it too much. It's important to have fun with ideas, but at the same time we are reminded of how painful reality is. If you run away from that pain, you're only making it worse. The early 1950s audience was expecting easily consumable entertainment, and when I look around these days, I'm also seeing some of that need for escapism. People wanted escapism back then, when they were still exhausted by atrocities. No matter how exhausted you are, you shouldn't forget how energizing this art form can be. Intense times call for intense creativity, whether you like it or not. You may have all kinds of opinions on so-called important films and how they should be made. Opinions sometimes just get in the way. You don't make movies with opinions. You need ideas. One of the biggest ideas in Rashomon is the sin of lying. Lying to yourself is the most interesting form of that. Today's atmosphere down here is heavily influenced by similar behavior. Murder and sexual assault are the principal crimes that cause the chain reaction in the story. Lying is intertwined with human language and nature. Regardless of religion or cultural differences. Sin is an old-fashioned term referring to a misdeed or a wrongdoing. The main religions of Japan don't talk about sin in the same way that other widespread belief systems do. Rashomon presents a more universal study on lying. From the most nuanced hints to the most outrageous fabrications. I wouldn't call this a plot-driven film. If you're fascinated by story structures, you will find this unique tale intriguing. I love how visual everything is, but also as a reader of classic stories, I'm noticing some similarities with the most inventing approaches to writing. I was happy to learn that one of the writers Kurosawa liked was Anton Chekhov. We have plenty of humor here in some of these scenes, and I wonder if Chekhov plays had anything to do with that. The priest is going to offer us his story and shed some light on what happened in those woods. He seems to have some sort of emotional connection with the wife of the samurai. The emotions of this woman made a strong impression on him. He's the most empathizing character, and he wants to understand the person who deserves it the most. According to the people who are listening to his story, he's probably doing too much of that. Machiko Kyo played the wife and did a great job as someone who is put under enormous pressure. She's good at taking advantage of the moments where she doesn't have any lines. It's the look. We're going to hear some more music in these scenes, Fumio Hayasaka composed a very minimalistic score for this film. He mixed classical and traditional influences. The use of drums is one of the most recognizable features, and it can be combined with many other instruments. Counterpoint is a term that is mentioned in relation to this music. It usually means a combination of melodies or musical elements. It can also be understood as a counter to the scene itself. The scene doesn't always need the most obvious accompaniment. Parts of the score are still old-fashioned and theatrical. It's understandable. Kurosawa and the composer were trying to experiment with new ways of using music and sounds. In Seven Samurai the music is more recognizable. That film is from 1954. Film music was changing in the early 50s. La Strada was a film by Fellini, and the main theme is incredibly memorable. Vertigo from 1958 has some of the best film music, but the soundtrack album started to be a thing in the 60s and 70s. Filmmaking includes music. It's quite strange that we don't have this kind of musical dedication anymore. It feels like we are going backwards in the world of cinema. It has to do with ignorance and indifference. Sometimes Hayasaka's music has had more specific influences. The long sequence where the wife is confronted with her inner conflict is accompanied by music that sounds like Bolero by Maurice Ravel. The original piece is a famous example of building momentum. It's the kind of emotional and ceremonial intensity that this scene needed. I think it's time to say, welcome to the middle of the film. I'm going to be quoting Monty Python's Meaning of Life. As long as films have middles. Right now the wife is caught in the middle of these two men. The wife covers her own face instead of the shadows doing it. She's reading a lot into the samurai's look. He doesn't say anything, and it seems like a cruel thing to do. She's experienced plenty of cruelty during the last 15 minutes. There are strong feelings of shame, and it reminds me of Japanese culture in some ways. In this case, she feels so trapped that it's very difficult to see a straightforward way out of this situation. In this version, her role is quite stereotypical. She's incredibly desperate and doesn't know how to be independent. It's good to keep in mind that this is a retelling, and it's drawing attention to this kind of treatment of a person. She cuts the ropes around him and says, "Kill me." She's holding this knife or dagger that to me represents sacrifice. Swords are thought to be masculine, and this film certainly confirms that. 1950 was too early for movies about female sword fighters. So who is going to be sacrificed with this dagger? We already know the answer. The basic question from the beginning has been, Who killed the victim and why? The story is not told from his point of view. We don't get a voice-over from his character. That is what happened in Sunset Boulevard, a film by Billy Wilder, also from 1950. We are going to see some scenes that focus more on his point of view. But there's always a mystery surrounding that. There's always some confusing factor. This of course creates another question. What kind of guy was the samurai? It's implied he's an important figure. He reminds me of a politician who doesn't really have a personality. The other characters are more genuine, and this proves how skilled the filmmakers were. The emotions are more genuine even when we learn that the story doesn't match what really happened. All of this acting business is something I could never do myself. I have no interest in that. Others have so much respect. Same thing with orchestras. That sort of performance. And of course you are usually not doing that by yourself. You can ask yourself, how much do you care about the samurai? The wife is extremely anxious about her own fate. It's implied that she either killed the man with that dagger or discovered the dead body with the dagger in him. She claims that she ran away and tried to take her own life. We see her blaming herself after everyone else blamed her. They talk down to her. And she also wants pity. She's still in shock and we can't draw any final conclusions. Now that the other guys at the gate have heard the priest describe his ideas, they have started to think that maybe the priest is too sensitive, that he was fooled by false emotion. This could be cynical speculation or reasonable reflection. Cynical speculation can also be a defense mechanism, much like statistics, especially the negative ones. The fact that I'm talking about defense mechanisms and people who are looking for excuses means that I believe in good qualities. At this point, an unusual method of communication is brought up. It's connected to old spiritual traditions. A medium is asked to contact the spirit of the deceased. This sequence brings the film closer to Japanese ghost stories. Some of the greatest ghost stories ever told. I could sit here all day and talk about them. I could talk about them until I pass away. Hopefully I get a chance to discuss those stories in another context. Kurosawa is clearly highlighting his audio-visual skills. Everything he learned about practical filmmaking. Hands-on creativity. He shows us how to use the environment, how to create atmosphere with images and sounds, The medium has a simple makeup design, and it slightly distorts the features. The wind is also intensifying this effect. Her voice, when she speaks as the dead person, has been manipulated. You can hear a kind of layered effect. To my knowledge, this is one of the first films to do that. In 1952, a French critic, Bazin, called this voice nightmarish and expressionistic. He was positively surprised when he heard about this terrifying tone. You feel like you're between two worlds. In the early 50s, most directors in the West had stopped using techniques and ideas like this. These ideas have always been important for the medium of cinema. The point of experimentation is that you use your imagination before you do the experiment. Being unorthodox for the sake of showing off is pointless. That's not how you get results. The possibility of getting results is like a lifeline. It has to do with imagination, risk-taking, and recognizing what works. You just have to believe in it and go to work. Trust your intuition. Let's see what happens. The medium of cinema came to be when some basic rules were established. Those rules can be broken, but you need a medium for that. Cinema has always been experimental. People were excited about this new world. Then there are people who are trying to destroy that medium, and they think they're breaking all the rules. If you don't know enough about it, the experiments lead to disintegration. You have to recognize creative opportunities. One of my favorite writers is Anton Chekhov, and he wrote a story where the characters are trying to remember someone's last name. That's the story. It has to do with history and misunderstanding. But you don't have to be an expert on facts. There's so much humanity in that story. It's called a horsey name, or a horse-like name. Of course, Rashomon is not just a writer's dream. It's like a gift to creative minds. If the filmmaker knows something about every part of making a film, he should also know how to use simplicity. Identify the way it benefits the film. Design a key moment. Let's see what you do with it. The actors are portraying different sides and internalizing various motives. It takes us away from the glamorous side of acting. They can personify almost every emotion under the sun. This is a chance to show depth and range, depending on what the storyteller is making it sound like. Filmmaking is filled with discoveries, and a performance can go in so many different directions. I can't say that I know myself incredibly well. That's not a weakness. I'm glad I can say that. You don't have to stay in the same place for the rest of your life. This film is also about choices. Future is created. Reality is created. The characters sometimes don't seem to know what they should do next. People don't know what they should say next. they end up revealing something embarrassing about themselves. You can't just please the masses with a film like this. And it takes us back to that good old painful reality. The story incorporates outside observers, but it's not just a photograph of reality. So many moviegoers say they want realism, but they clearly can't deal with reality. Not even on film. That is what it seems like. The idea of realism is different depending on the point of view. Some people are just looking for something they like. I want realism to mean something. It has to stand out. And you won't always like it either. It will be almost like a weapon. I don't know what that says about me. This film forces you to do many things, even when it's not exactly realistic. Literal-minded people probably don't like this film. That is unfortunately a growing population. Well, let's see what happens. I guess I just like human experiments. The spiritual medium's monologue is about to conclude. Masayuki Mori, who played the samurai, is doing some amazing acting in this scene. It's always understated. We are going to hear the version no one else has told before. The voice is asking who's crying. This is connected to the end of the film. More about that later. The samurai has a crying voice and suddenly feels some tears running down his face. The idea of taking his own life strikes like a lightning. The sacrificial dagger itself is lit almost like a lightning, or something that radiates light. He takes his own life. This type of blade is usually called a knife. I've been calling it a dagger because of ritualistic associations. Taking your own life was part of the samurai code. They used a knife like this, and sometimes they would stab the heart instead of the abdominal area. Feelings of shame are once again strong, regardless of the function of this ritual. We get a description of the final moments. The medium's monologue is also contradictory. The spiritual dimension is more powerful than facts. It makes you care more about the victim, but it's done in a very symbolic way. Even though it's not an accurate retelling, the emotions represent the loss of life in a beautiful way. Noriko Honma played the medium, and the acting is convincing. These are some of the most tragic moments in the whole film. The way spirits travel in Japanese ghost stories is truly beautiful. There's no one correct way. They make things and people more otherworldly. And they can also be unpredictable. At the Demon Gate, we are still wondering which account is giving us the true events. I have one more comment about the medium who supposedly spoke with the dead man's voice. After the monologue ends, we are left with two options. Either the medium was lying, or the spirit didn't want to give us the real version. The spirit of the dead person was too ashamed. This is not my interpretation. I tend to believe that the medium was basically giving us a show, and that's all it was. Usually the dead don't lie about themselves in stories. In any case, that is an interesting idea. There's a well-known idea that demons are liars or pretenders. Demonic possession is not common in Japanese tradition. Unclean spirits are typically influencing people without taking over their bodies. The medium's voice is most likely not that of a demon, even though it may sound like it. This film is a good example of technique and tradition. These two worlds, filmmaking and culture, have been mixed. This is something that impressed that French critic, Bazin. Once again, we can learn more about our own traditions when we see others achieve success. I can think of some examples, a selection of similar films that are not from Japan. They are European, and some of them could even be American. I guess I'm going to talk about those films at some point. Kurosawa is not too self-conscious about his use of Japanese culture and motifs. Being born in a country is not something you choose. You just happen to be surrounded by everything. That is something I understand. You don't have to try too hard to make everything in your film so carefully placed. It would almost be like product placement. The woodcutter is changing his story. Apparently he saw all those people when they were still alive. The commoner, aka the long-haired guy, is really pressing him, and it's something that people in the audience would also be doing. He was afraid to reveal all these details. All the arguments and fights before the samurai lost his life. If you lie to the police force, you should stick to that story. The woodcutter's emotional development is leading to some unexpected openness. The expectation now is that his new awareness will compensate for his faults. The bandit violated the woman in front of her spouse. The aftermath was so unpleasant that he's attempting to apologize. Apologizing is apparently not enough. He has the audacity to ask this woman to marry him. He's definitely not sorry for anything. The bandit thinks this woman has no future with a respected upper-class man. The samurai responds with a demand that is even worse. He tells her that she should use the knife to end her own life. That doesn't go down well either. She refuses to kill herself. Are we actually going to see this woman stab her husband? These two have the most intense relationship. It's like a dance. And then it stops. It always comes to a standstill. And the knife is held high. We already saw a variation of this situation. The only way you can change this story is with some eyewitness accounts. Here we have a woman holding a knife between two masculine swords. Let's see how this one ends. The wife of the samurai is finally showing some independent courage. She says, "You're weak." Throughout this story she's being told what her life supposedly is. We are now learning more about what that life could be if the men weren't so controlling. Some people might point out that she chose this life. We don't know everything about her history. At this point she's tired of a boring and highly managed existence. It appears that she tried to arrange things so that these two men would fight and one of them would die. I first saw this film about 15 years ago. I didn't know much about the director. All I heard was samurai this, samurai that. Seven Samurai is overrepresented. And Kurosawa shouldn't be known for one thing. At one point I realized how inventive he was, and I became more interested in his work. You have to spend your life doing these things. And it means that recommendations are not enough. You have to be active. Get a list of directors, for example, and then just watch those films. If something is hard to find, you just have to look for it. It is that easy. Rashomon is quite hard to describe, and that can be a real blessing. It can benefit your film as an experience. I don't watch this film like a detective story. Thankfully, people aren't just focusing on that. That sort of discussion will always be part of this experience. Maybe among those who are more interested in what happens next. As far as black and white woods movies go, there's one other classic that comes in mind, and that is Virgin Spring. That's an Ingmar Bergman film from 1960. The crime committed against the only woman in this story is one of the central events. That crime could be seen as the main connection between these two films, but it's not the only connection. Her personality is more complex compared to Virgin Spring. Both films could benefit from additional development, although here she's basically showing us a completely different side. We don't know what happens to her after this. She doesn't die in this film. We never see her family or anything like that. There's no revenge either. Some people might say that the story is too old. But you can always come up with new ways of telling that story. The men are now ready for a duel. What follows is a disordered and fevered sword fight. This is a mixture of what the storyteller saw and what he's making it sound like. These two are completely losing their minds. The heat has been scorching everyone in this tale of the woods. It seems like whoever is more insane wins. It's borderline wrestling. I'm not a wrestling fan myself, not a commentator either. I am not on that level. This is one of the most realistic fights. It's not really a choreographed sword fight. The fights and battles in his films became eventually bigger and at times more violent. He went from the lowest budget to the most expensive and time-consuming productions. His future projects called for it. And he was always a risk-taker. The financial gambles were insane. The worst one happened in the 70s. He was making an unconventional film, and eventually the unsuccessful release sent him to a self-destructive spiral. But he recovered from that. If you have a vision, you will survive. No matter what. It may be hard to believe now that everything is calculated in the form of numbers. And the ones who calculate don't believe in your vision. Well, to hell with that. The director had an interesting relationship with the samurai figures and personalities. He's a descendant of a samurai family. He was born about 50 years after the new military force took over. This older soldier caste is not portrayed as a homogeneous force. As an inward-looking filmmaker, he includes symbols and figures that are more in-depth. What I get from his films has less to do with political analysis and more to do with human nature and mortality. He explored these characters like no one else. The narrative choices show that he preferred a historical setting instead of a fact-based approach. Maybe it has something to do with reading fiction. He knew how to use symbolic characters instead of following a more biographical recital. He never lost sight of the people in his films. Historical facts and accuracy can sometimes replace the performances and visual ideas. The bandit is able to overpower his opponent. The wealthy samurai comes across as quite fearful. He is surprised to find himself in a situation that is possibly going to be extremely unsuitable and humiliating. He says, "I don't want to die." But he does. The bandit now approaches the wife. Almost like he's about to repeat what he did before. She eventually manages to escape. The samurai in this film is someone who is killed over and over again. They remember his death. He didn't want to have this kind of afterlife in memories and retellings. There's no dialogue in the rest of this scene. It's really showing the language of movement. This is one of those moments where the world around you seems to disappear. The environment in the scene is alive. He is alone in nature. The passage of time can be felt while we hear some noises of nature. These sounds are turned up whenever the music fades into the background. Silence spreads, or an atmospheric silence. This is the last account we are going to see and hear. Now they have to decide which version to believe. Who knows? The police apparently doesn't know. The question is, who wants to know? And who decides the final verdict? The priest and the woodcutter still can't come to an agreement. Are we still just talking about lies? Who can you trust these days? If we can't trust people, the world is the same as hell. The commoner has a more cynical philosophy. The world is already like hell. Let's keep that in mind when we watch the rest of this scene. I personally love it when films just openly ask, "What do you care about?" I've been asking so many fun questions. That might be the funnest. I don't think the people under this roof could ever come to an agreement. They just have different viewpoints. We don't ultimately know what happened. You can blame human beings for that. Or is it the demons driving everyone crazy? You can be the judge. The story is interesting enough without the supernatural. I don't believe in demons. One of the ideas at the end is that people only care about themselves. I wouldn't say that it's the message of the film. When it comes to films having a lesson or a message, I usually couldn't care less. Let's see how accurate this idea is during the final minutes. I'm fine with this film being open-ended. This is what you are left with. Then we suddenly hear a voice. It's not a crying samurai, it's a crying infant. This kind of stuff apparently happened at old gates like this. In this case, we don't know who left this unwanted baby. It seems rather miraculous in a strange way. To some it may seem random. This moment is incredibly dramatic, but it's based on something that was reported during those times. Of course, your reaction depends on your culture and background. The commoner decides to steal some clothes that were around the child. These are desperate times, and he seizes the opportunity. He doesn't feel the need to pretend anymore. I think he was pretending to be more insightful than the others. And we can see ourselves in this character. The commoner is holding on to those clothes like he can't survive without them. He thinks it's justified. Is anyone better than him? He thinks we are nothing but thieves and hypocrites. We are going back and forth with these characters. In terms of identifying, we're still doing that at the end of the film. The sin of lying is paired with the sin of stealing. He accuses the woodcutter of stealing as well. This is apparently extremely embarrassing, and this humble worker can't say anything back. It's a moment of realization. Is another person's theft somehow more severe? If you're fine with stealing, might as well be fine with lying about it also. And if everyone already knows that you're stealing, you're going to have to start calling that action something else. Give it a much nicer name. What can you do in this situation? The priest is holding the baby as if it's his assignment, as if it's the most natural outcome. The woodcutter's inner conflict seems to grow stronger. My last question is this: how do we change our behavior? We all have bad qualities, but it doesn't mean that everything is justified. If groups of people are doing something terrible, it may seem acceptable to take part in that and change your mind about it. Positive change is harder to promote, also harder to implement. When it comes to positive change, people usually start with doing small things. I don't think that's enough. I guess they lack the ability to step back and have a sense of balance. These two characters have been learning more and more about that. If someone brings up positive change, you start thinking about the future, including the younger generations. Surely you haven't given up on them. Even in the middle of all this demon talk. It's mainly you doing the talking. Maybe you just have to be a good example. The woodcutter says he's going to adopt this infant. One more child added to a big family. It's the only way he can straighten himself out. One of the demons that inhabited this gate was called Ibaraki Doji. The name means demon child. I think this abandoned child is the opposite of that. At least right now. He's everything that could be better. This is a new beginning, even if it's a cliché. This child doesn't have to be a demon. You just have to be human. That is enough. And that's enough from me. It's sunny outside and I'm going for a walk. Don't forget to improve yourself.